They tell you it's a glorious calling. To serve in the Imperial Guard, the mighty hammer of the Emperor's will, standing alongside millions of brave souls in humanity's endless war against the darkness. They speak of honor in service, of brotherhood forged in battle, of the pride that comes from defending the Imperium against xenos filth, heretical scum, and the demon spawn of the warp. They paint pictures of heroic last stands, victorious charges, and the grateful tears of civilians you've saved from unspeakable fates. What they don't tell you is that you are not a soldier. You are ammunition. What they don't tell you is that your life expectancy is measured in hours, not years, and that the vast majority of Imperial Guardsmen die screaming and forgotten on worlds whose names they never learned. What they don't tell you is that your commanders view you as a statistic in calculations where acceptable losses are measured in millions, and that your death will be considered successful if it delays the enemy for even a few minutes. What they don't tell you is that courage is irrelevant when you're facing enemies that can kill you with a thought, that your training is meaningless against foes who have been perfecting warfare for longer than human civilization has existed, and that your equipment is deliberately designed to be just barely adequate because manufacturing better gear would be a waste of resources on soldiers who won't live long enough to use it effectively. What they don't tell you is that the real enemy isn't the aliens or heretics you're sent to fight. It's the Imperium itself, a system so vast and callous that it considers human life the cheapest resource in the galaxy, to be expended without hesitation or regret whenever tactical necessity demands sacrifice. What they don't tell you is that the Emperor's protection is a myth, that the commissars behind you are more dangerous than the enemies in front of you, and that survival in the Imperial Guard requires not heroism, but a willingness to abandon every principle of human decency that you once thought defined you. My name was Private Torvin Hecht of the Vostroyan 212th Firstborn Regiment, and I served for 7 years, 4 months, and 13 days in the Imperial Guard before deserting during the evacuation of Hive World Magnolia. I survived campaigns on 11 different worlds, witnessed the deaths of over 3,000 fellow guardsmen, and learned that the only way to stay alive in the Emperor's service is to become something that no longer deserves to live. This is the terrifying truth of life as an Imperial Guardsman. To discover that you are not a hero defending humanity, but a disposable tool in the hands of a machine that measures victory in the arithmetic of acceptable extinction. I was born on Vostroya, a frigid industrial world, where the principal export was soldiers and the principal import was bodies sent home from distant battlefields. My earliest memories are of the factory districts where my father worked 16-hour shifts, manufacturing laser guns and flak armor for regiments that would never return, and of the recruitment centers where young men queued for the privilege of dying on worlds they'd never heard of for causes they'd never understand. Vostroyan society was built around the concept of debt, a spiritual obligation to the Emperor that could only be repaid through military service. Every family owed the Imperium their firstborn son, a tradition that had persisted for over 3 millennia and had consumed millions of lives while providing the galaxy with some of its most disciplined and reliable regiments. The debt wasn't metaphorical. It was recorded in official documents, tracked by administratum clerks, and enforced by commissars who would execute entire families if their firstborn attempted to evade service. The system was designed to ensure a steady supply of soldiers while eliminating any possibility that parents might refuse to surrender their children to the military machine. My father had served in the 147th Firstborn during the cleansing of Mordian, a campaign that had lasted 7 years and had resulted in the deaths of 80% of the regiment before victory was achieved. He rarely spoke about his experiences, but the scars that covered his body and the nightmares that woke him screaming provided sufficient education about what military service actually entailed. My mother had lost 3 brothers to Imperial Guard service before my father returned from Mordian. Uncle Pavel had died during the assault on Hive Primus. Uncle Dmitri had been killed by friendly fire during a retreat operation, and Uncle Grigory had simply disappeared during the chaos of urban warfare. His body never recovered and his fate never determined. Their names were inscribed on monuments throughout Vostroya, along with millions of others who had paid the debt that their families owed to the Emperor. The industrial districts where I grew up were monuments to the military machine that dominated every aspect of Vostroyan life. The factories produced nothing but weapons, armor, and military equipment that would be shipped to regiments throughout the galaxy. The schools taught nothing but military history, tactical theory, and the religious doctrine that justified endless warfare in the Emperor's name. The entertainment programs broadcast nothing but propaganda films that depicted Imperial Guard service as glorious and noble. Even the architecture of our cities reflected the military culture that defined Vostroyan identity. Every building was constructed like a fortress, with firing positions built into walls and defensive positions integrated into civilian infrastructure. The streets were laid out according to tactical principles that would allow rapid movement of troops while providing multiple fallback positions if the city came under attack. Children learned to march before they learned to walk, to shoot before they learned to read, and to follow orders before they learned to think independently. The educational system was designed to produce soldiers rather than citizens, with every lesson reinforcing the values of discipline, obedience, and sacrifice that would prepare us for military service. By the age of 10, I could field strip a laser gun blindfolded, identify enemy aircraft by their engine sounds, and recite the major Imperial victories of the past millennium along with the casualty figures that those victories had required. By 15, I was qualified as a sharpshooter with both LAS and solid projectile weapons, trained in basic combat medicine, and educated in the tactical doctrines that governed Imperial Guard operations throughout the galaxy. The final 2 years before conscription was spent in preparatory training that simulated actual combat conditions while testing our psychological suitability for military service. We conducted live fire exercises in abandoned factory districts, participated in survival training in the frozen wastelands outside the cities, and underwent psychological evaluation designed to identify individuals who might break under the stress of actual warfare. The psychological testing was particularly thorough, involving exposure to recordings of real battlefield conditions while monitoring our responses for signs of cowardice, instability, or insufficient dedication to Imperial values. The testing eliminated approximately 30% of potential recruits, who were reassigned to industrial work while their families were marked as having failed to fulfill their obligation to the Emperor. Those who passed the psychological evaluation underwent final medical examinations that assessed our physical condition while installing identification devices and loyalty implants that would allow military authorities to track our location and monitor our behavior throughout our service careers. The implants were presented as protective measures that would help military medical personnel treat our injuries, but everyone understood that they were actually control mechanisms designed to prevent desertion. On my 18th birthday, I received my conscription notice along with transportation orders that would take me to the Vostroyan 212th Firstborn Regiment, which was being formed to replace the previous 212th that had been destroyed during the Siege of Coriolis. The notice provided no information about where the regiment would be deployed or what type of campaign we would be assigned to, only that I was required to report for duty within 72 hours or face execution for treason. The farewell ceremony was conducted according to traditions that dated back to the founding of the Vostroyan military system. My family gathered to formally transfer their debt to the Emperor while accepting that they might never see me again. My father presented me with the regimental insignia that he had worn during his own service, while my mother blessed me with prayers that would supposedly provide protection against the enemies I would face. But beneath the formal ritual was the unspoken understanding that this was likely the last time we would be together. Vostroyan regiments were rarely deployed to defend their home world, and survival rates for Imperial Guard service were so low that most families considered their sons dead the moment they received their conscription notices. The journey to the regimental formation point took 6 weeks aboard a massive transport vessel that carried 20,000 newly conscripted soldiers from various Vostroyan recruiting districts. The ship was a converted cargo hauler that had been modified with minimal life support systems and basic training facilities, designed to transport large numbers of troops as efficiently as possible while providing rudimentary preparation for military service. The accommodations were deliberately harsh, intended to begin the psychological conditioning that would prepare us for the hardships of military life. We were housed in cargo holds that had been fitted with triple-stacked bunks, provided with rations that met minimum nutritional requirements while tasting like recycled cardboard, and subjected to training schedules that allowed only 4 hours of sleep per day. The training during transport focused on basic military skills that most of us had already learned during our preparatory education, but the real purpose was psychological conditioning designed to break down individual identity while building unit cohesion. We were assigned to squads based on psychological compatibility rather than regional origin, forced to compete with each other for basic necessities, and subjected to discipline that emphasized absolute obedience to authority. The ship's commissars conducted regular indoctrination sessions that reinforced Imperial ideology while identifying potential troublemakers who might require special attention during military service. These sessions involved group recitation of Imperial prayers, discussion of military history that emphasized the importance of sacrifice, and psychological exercises designed to measure our commitment to Imperial values. During one particularly memorable session, Commissar Volga explained the mathematical reality of Imperial Guard service with brutal honesty that contradicted everything we had been taught during our preparatory training. He informed us that the average life expectancy for newly deployed Imperial Guardsmen was 15 hours of combat, that the majority of regiments suffered casualty rates exceeding 90% during their first campaign, and that our primary value to the Imperium was not our military effectiveness, but our availability in sufficient numbers to overwhelm enemies through sheer attrition. "You are not soldiers," he told us, his augmetic eye scanning our ranks for signs of weakness or rebellion. "You are components in a military machine that processes human lives into tactical advantages. Your individual survival is irrelevant to the successful completion of your mission. Your individual death is acceptable if it contributes to the greater objective of Imperial victory." The brutal honesty was intended to eliminate any romantic notions about military service while preparing us for the reality that we would likely die during our first deployment. But it was also intended to identify individuals who might be psychologically unsuitable for service, who could be eliminated before they had opportunities to contaminate the regiment with defeatist attitudes. Several recruits requested reassignment or medical evaluation following Commissar Volga's presentation, only to discover that such requests were considered evidence of cowardice that warranted immediate execution. The executions were conducted publicly, with the entire transport's population required to witness the consequences of insufficient dedication to Imperial service. The regimental formation process took place on the fortress world of Cardia, where newly conscripted troops from various planets were organized into combat units while receiving final training in the tactics and equipment they would use during actual campaigns. The process typically lasted 6 months and involved constant evaluation to determine which roles individual soldiers would fill within the regimental structure. Cardia was a world entirely dedicated to military preparation, its surface covered with training facilities, weapons ranges, and mock battlefields that simulated every type of combat environment that Imperial forces might encounter. The planet's population consisted entirely of military personnel, support staff, and the prisoners who served as live targets during training exercises that required realistic combat conditions. The training facilities were designed to prepare soldiers for warfare against every type of enemy that threatened the Imperium, from xenos species whose capabilities defied human understanding to chaos forces that could corrupt reality itself. Each facility specialized in different aspects of combat training, requiring soldiers to rotate through multiple locations while mastering the diverse skills necessary for Imperial Guard service. The first phase of training involved weapons qualification on every type of equipment that Imperial Guard regiments might be issued, from basic laser guns and frag grenades to specialized weapons designed for specific types of enemies. The weapons training was conducted under combat conditions, with live ammunition and realistic targets that fought back using automated systems controlled by training supervisors. I discovered that my marksmanship skills, which had earned praise during preparatory training on Vostroya, were merely adequate by Imperial Guard standards. The weapons we would be using in actual combat were more sophisticated than training equipment, but they were also less reliable and more prone to malfunction under battlefield conditions. More importantly, the enemies we would face possessed capabilities that made marksmanship almost irrelevant as a survival skill. The second phase involved tactical training in small unit operations, teaching squads to function effectively under conditions that ranged from urban warfare to void combat. The training scenarios were based on actual historical battles, with detailed reconstruction of the conditions that Imperial forces had faced during previous campaigns. The scenarios were designed to test not just tactical competence, but psychological resilience under extreme stress. During one exercise, my squad was assigned to defend a strategic position against simulated orc attackers using automated systems that replicated enemy behavior patterns with disturbing accuracy. The defense lasted 18 hours and involved constant close-quarters combat against enemies that felt no fear, showed no mercy, and seemed to multiply faster than they could be killed. The exercise concluded with our position being overrun despite our best efforts, teaching us that tactical competence was insufficient against enemies whose capabilities exceeded human limitations. The lesson was reinforced by casualty statistics from actual battles, showing that Imperial Guard units typically achieve their objectives through sacrifice rather than tactical superiority. The third phase involved specialized training for the specific type of campaign that our regiment was being prepared for, though we weren't informed about our ultimate destination until the training was nearly complete. The specialized training focused on urban warfare techniques, suggesting that we would be deployed to a hive world or similar environment where fighting would take place in confined spaces against well-entrenched enemies. Urban warfare training was conducted in mock cities that had been constructed to replicate the conditions of actual hive worlds, complete with civilian populations played by prisoners who had been sentenced to serve as training aids. The training scenarios involved not just combat operations, but also crowd control, civilian evacuation, and the countless complications that arose when military operations took place in populated areas. The most disturbing aspect of the urban warfare training was learning that civilian casualties were not just acceptable but often necessary for achieving military objectives. We were taught to evaluate civilian populations as potential resources or obstacles rather than people deserving protection, and to make tactical decisions based on strategic value rather than humanitarian concerns. During one scenario, my squad was ordered to secure a strategic position that was occupied by civilian refugees who had been fleeing from advancing enemy forces. The tactical situation required us to choose between allowing the civilians to evacuate, which would delay our mission and potentially allow enemies to escape, or securing the position immediately while accepting civilian casualties as an unavoidable consequence of military necessity. When I hesitated to execute the order, Commissar Volga personally intervened to explain that protecting civilian lives was secondary to completing military objectives, and that soldiers who prioritized humanitarian concerns over tactical requirements were guilty of treason that warranted immediate execution. The lesson was reinforced by requiring me to personally execute several civilians who were actually prisoners serving as training aids. The final phase of training involved live combat exercises against actual enemies, using prisoners of war and captured heretics as opponents who would fight for their lives while providing realistic combat experience for newly trained soldiers. These exercises were conducted with minimal supervision, allowing trainees to experience actual warfare while eliminating enemies who might otherwise require their execution or long-term imprisonment. The live combat training revealed that everything we had learned during previous phases was inadequate preparation for fighting enemies who possessed capabilities that exceeded human limitations. The prisoners we faced had been selected specifically because they represented the types of opponents that Imperial Guard forces actually encountered. including individuals with psychic abilities, enhanced physical capabilities, or access to technologies that made conventional tactics ineffective. My first kill was a former PDF trooper who had been captured during a planetary uprising and sentenced to serve as a training target. He was armed with basic weapons and given a chance to win his freedom by surviving the training exercise, creating conditions where he would fight with desperate intensity while providing realistic combat experience for trainees. The engagement lasted 4 hours and involved constant movement through urban terrain while tracking an opponent who possessed superior knowledge of the environment and greater combat experience than any of the trainees. The prisoner used guerrilla tactics that exploited our inexperience while demonstrating the type of creativity and adaptability that made veteran opponents so dangerous. When I finally cornered and killed the prisoner, I expected to feel satisfaction or pride in successfully completing the exercise. Instead, I experienced only emptiness and the growing realization that the skills I had developed were barely adequate for surviving against enemies who were far more dangerous than captured prisoners fighting with minimal equipment. The completion of training was marked by a ceremony where we received our final assignments and learned the destination of our first deployment. The Vostroyan 212th Firstborn Regiment would be sent to Hive World Magnolia, where a massive Genestealer infestation had been discovered in the lower levels of the primary Hive city. Our mission was to eliminate the infestation while preventing its spread to other areas of the planet. The briefing materials described Magnolia as a routine pest control operation that would provide valuable combat experience for a newly formed regiment while contributing to the protection of an important industrial world. The estimated duration of the campaign was 6 months, with casualty projections of 30 to 40%, which were considered acceptable for this type of operation. But the briefing materials omitted crucial information about the nature of Genestealer infestations and the tactical challenges they presented to conventional military forces. Genestealers were not simple predators that could be eliminated through superior firepower and tactical coordination. They were highly intelligent infiltrators who could corrupt human populations while preparing entire worlds for consumption by Tyranid hive fleets. The journey to Magnolia took 3 months aboard a troop transport that carried our entire regiment along with supporting elements from other Imperial forces. The ship was better equipped than the vessel that had brought us to Cadia, but the accommodations were still deliberately harsh to maintain military discipline while preventing soldiers from becoming too comfortable during extended voyages. During the journey, we received additional briefings about our mission that gradually revealed the true scope of the threat we would be facing. The Genestealer infestation had been growing undetected for at least 2 generations, with hybrid cultists infiltrating every level of the planetary government while preparing for a coordinated uprising that would coincide with the arrival of Tyranid forces. The intelligence reports described a situation that was far more complex and dangerous than the routine pest control operation that had been described during our initial briefing. The enemy possessed superior knowledge of the Hive city's layout, had access to military equipment through their infiltration of security forces, and commanded the loyalty of civilian populations who had been indoctrinated or transformed by Genestealer influence. More disturbing was the revelation that the planetary government had requested Imperial intervention only after the infestation had reached proportions that made conventional suppression methods ineffective. The delay had allowed the Genestealers to establish defensive positions throughout the Hive city while corrupting infrastructure systems that could be used as weapons against Imperial forces. Our regiment would be conducting urban warfare against enemies who possessed every possible advantage: superior numbers, intimate knowledge of the terrain, access to advanced weaponry, and the psychological advantage of fighting to defend their homes and families. The tactical situation was so unfavorable that success would require accepting casualty rates that approached total regiment destruction. The revelation that we were being sent to what amounted to a suicide mission created widespread demoralization among the regiment's enlisted personnel, but any expression of concern was immediately suppressed by commissars who executed several soldiers for defeatist attitudes that threatened unit morale. The executions were conducted publicly to remind the rest of us that the enemy behind us was more immediate and certain than the enemy we would face on Magnolia. Our arrival at Magnolia confirmed that the intelligence briefings had understated rather than exaggerated the severity of the situation. The Hive City's upper levels appeared normal from orbit, but closer inspection revealed signs of systematic preparation for coordinated resistance that suggested the infestation had reached proportions that threatened the entire planet. The primary Hive City housed over 200 million people, most of whom had been exposed to genestealer influence through contaminated food supplies, infected water systems, or direct contact with hybrid infiltrators. The planetary government estimated that approximately 30% of the population had been compromised to some degree, but acknowledged that their intelligence-gathering capabilities had been severely degraded by the infestation. The deployment process involved establishing base camps in the Hive City's upper levels while conducting reconnaissance operations to map the extent of genestealer control in the lower districts. The reconnaissance revealed that the enemy had converted entire residential areas into fortified positions while establishing industrial facilities for producing weapons and equipment to support their resistance efforts. My first combat deployment was a reconnaissance patrol assigned to investigate reports of enemy activity in Manufacturing District Epsilon 7, a mid-level industrial area that had been abandoned by its original occupants but showed signs of recent habitation. The patrol consisted of my squad, plus supporting elements from the regiment's reconnaissance specialists, with orders to gather intelligence while avoiding direct confrontation with enemy forces. The district appeared deserted when we arrived, but careful observation revealed subtle signs of recent activity, equipment that had been moved, surfaces that had been cleaned, and atmospheric recycling systems that were operating despite the absence of registered occupants. The signs suggested that the area was being used as a staging ground for enemy operations while maintaining the appearance of abandonment. The investigation required moving through industrial facilities that provided countless opportunities for ambushes while limiting visibility and mobility for attacking forces. The environment favored defenders who possessed intimate knowledge of the area while creating disadvantages for troops who were unfamiliar with the layout and had to assume that every shadow might conceal enemies. The first contact with enemy forces occurred when we discovered a hidden entrance to tunnels that had been excavated beneath the official facility plans. The tunnels were recent construction, suggesting that the genestealers had been preparing defensive positions for months while maintaining operational security that had prevented their detection by planetary authorities. The tunnel entrance was guarded by a hybrid cultist whose appearance was so close to baseline human that we almost mistook him for a lost civilian, until his behavior revealed the alien influence that had corrupted his consciousness. His reaction to our presence was immediate and violent, attacking with enhanced physical capabilities while calling for reinforcements using communication methods that didn't rely on technological devices. The engagement lasted only a few minutes, but it provided crucial insights into the nature of our enemies that contradicted everything we had been taught during training. The hybrid possessed strength and speed that exceeded normal human capabilities, showed no fear of death or injury, and demonstrated tactical awareness that suggested intelligence rather than simple predatory instinct. More disturbing was the realization that distinguishing between corrupted and uncontaminated humans would be extremely difficult under combat conditions. The hybrid's appearance was close enough to normal that visual identification was unreliable, while his behavior was strange rather than obviously alien until the moment of attack. The ambiguity meant that any civilian contact could potentially be deadly, while also raising the possibility that Imperial forces might kill uncontaminated civilians who exhibited suspicious behavior. The reinforcements that responded to the hybrid's call included both additional cultists and pure genestealers whose appearance left no doubt about their alien nature. The engagement escalated rapidly as enemies emerged from concealed positions throughout the industrial facility, using their superior knowledge of the environment to establish tactical advantages that conventional military doctrine hadn't prepared us to counter. The Genis stealers moved through the industrial machinery with an agility that made them almost impossible to target effectively, while their natural armor provided protection against weapons that should have been lethal to biological targets. Their attack patterns seemed random at first, but careful observation revealed sophisticated coordination that suggested hive-mind intelligence directing their tactics. The firefight continued for over an hour as we attempted to withdraw from the facility while fighting enemies who seemed to multiply faster than we could eliminate them. Our ammunition reserves were depleted rapidly against opponents who required multiple hits to neutralize, while our tactical options were limited by environment that favored close-quarters combat where the enemy's physical advantages were most pronounced. My squad suffered 60% casualties during the withdrawal, with 2 soldiers killed outright and 4 others wounded severely enough to require immediate medical evacuation. The tactical lessons learned from the engagement were distributed throughout the regiment, but they provided little comfort since they revealed that our standard weapons and tactics were barely adequate against enemies who possessed significant advantages in every category of combat effectiveness. The regiment's casualties during the first week of deployment exceeded 20%, with most losses occurring during reconnaissance operations that encountered enemy resistance far more sophisticated and effective than intelligence estimates had predicted. The casualty rate was sustainable mathematically, but the psychological impact on surviving personnel was severe enough to require intervention by regimental commissars. The psychological pressure was intensified by the realization that our mission parameters had been based on intelligence that was either deliberately misleading or catastrophically inadequate. Instead of conducting a pest control operation against simple predators, we were fighting a coordinated military campaign against enemies who possessed superior tactical positions, local population support, and biological capabilities that made conventional warfare strategies ineffective. The enemy's infiltration of civilian populations created moral dilemmas that our training hadn't prepared us to address. We were required to treat every civilian contact as a potential security threat, while also attempting to protect uncontaminated populations from Genestealer influence. The contradiction created situations where tactical necessity conflicted with humanitarian obligations, forcing soldiers to make decisions that would haunt them regardless of the choices they made. During one patrol operation, my squad encountered a group of civilians who claimed to be fleeing from Genestealer attacks in the lower levels. The civilians appeared to be uncontaminated humans seeking protection from Imperial forces, but their presence in an area that should have been evacuated raised suspicions about their true nature and intentions. The tactical protocols required us to detain the civilians for screening by regimental intelligence personnel, but the detention process would delay our mission while potentially exposing our position to enemy observation. The civilians' behavior was consistent with fear and desperation, but training had taught us that hybrid infiltrators were skilled at mimicking normal human emotional responses. When we attempted to implement detention procedures, several of the civilians panicked and began running toward areas that were known to be under enemy control. The behavior could have been explained by fear of Imperial forces, but it could also have been an attempt to warn Genestealer forces about our patrol route and tactical objectives. The squad leader made the decision to open fire on the fleeing civilians, killing 3 individuals whose post-mortem examination revealed no signs of alien contamination. The decision was tactically sound according to our rules of engagement, but psychologically devastating for soldiers who had been trained to protect civilians rather than kill them based on suspicious behavior. The incident was reported through official channels and judged to be an acceptable application of tactical discretion under combat conditions. But the psychological impact created lasting trauma for every member of the squad, contributing to the cumulative stress that was degrading our unit's combat effectiveness with each passing day. The moral ambiguity of fighting enemies who had infiltrated civilian populations was compounded by the realization that many of the contaminated humans we were killing had been infected against their will and retained enough human consciousness to experience terror and pain during their deaths. The Genestealer infection process didn't eliminate human awareness. It corrupted it while preserving enough original personality to make the transformation psychologically torturous for the victims. The infected civilians we encountered were neither fully human nor completely alien, but something caught between states of being that made their elimination both necessary and morally devastating. They retained memories of their previous lives, emotional connections to family and friends, and human desires and fears that made their deaths feel like murder rather than legitimate military action. The psychological pressure created by these moral contradictions was exacerbated by the physical demands of urban warfare in an environment that favored enemies who possessed superior mobility, enhanced sensory capabilities, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The constant stress of combat operations, while maintaining alertness for infiltration attempts, created fatigue that degraded decision-making capabilities, while increasing the likelihood of mistakes that could prove fatal. After 6 weeks of operations on Magnolia, our regiment had suffered casualty rates approaching 50% while achieving tactical objectives that intelligence analysts described as marginally significant in terms of overall campaign success. The mathematical reality was that we were losing soldiers faster than we were eliminating enemies, creating unsustainable attrition that would result in complete regiment destruction within 3 months if operational patterns continued unchanged. The high casualty rates were not aberrations or tactical failures. They were the predictable result of deploying conventional military forces against enemies who possessed advantages that made conventional warfare ineffective. The Imperial Guard command structure understood this reality but considered it acceptable because replacement troops could be provided more quickly and cheaply than developing new tactics or equipment that might improve survival rates. The replacement process involved regular shipments of newly trained soldiers who would be integrated into existing units to maintain authorized strength levels while compensating for combat losses. The replacements typically arrived with training that was even more limited than our own, having been processed through accelerated programs designed to produce maximum numbers of troops rather than maximum individual competence. My squad received 3 replacement soldiers during our 7th week on Magnolia, young men who had completed basic training but had never experienced actual combat against enemies who could kill them. Their integration into the squad required experienced personnel to provide guidance and protection while they adapted to combat conditions, creating additional burdens for survivors who were already operating under extreme stress. The replacements brought news from other Imperial Guard regiments deployed throughout the sector, revealing that the situation on Magnolia was representative of Imperial military operations rather than an exceptional circumstance. Across dozens of worlds, newly formed regiments were being fed into combat operations, where casualty rates exceeded 70% while achieving strategic objectives that were measured in kilometers of ground, gained rather than enemies eliminated. The systematic nature of these casualty rates made it clear that Imperial military doctrine treated human soldiers as expendable resources whose primary value was their availability in sufficient quantities to overwhelm enemies through attrition. Individual survival was irrelevant to strategic planning, while unit effectiveness was measured by willingness to accept losses rather than ability to achieve objectives with minimal casualties. But the most disturbing revelation was that many of the campaigns where Imperial Guard regiments were being sacrificed served no strategic purpose beyond providing combat experience for commanders who were being prepared for more important operations. Regiments like ours were being used as training aids for officers whose careers would benefit from demonstrating their willingness to expend human resources in pursuit of tactical objectives. The realization that our suffering and death served primarily as resume enhancement for ambitious officers created a level of demoralization that threatened unit cohesion while undermining the ideological foundations that justified Imperial Guard service. Soldiers who had accepted sacrifice as necessary for defending humanity found it difficult to maintain motivation when their deaths served only to advance the careers of individuals who viewed them as disposable assets. The psychological impact was compounded by the behavior of our regimental officers, who had adapted to the reality of high casualty rates by developing emotional detachment that prevented them from forming personal connections with soldiers under their command. The officers treated enlisted personnel as interchangeable components rather than individuals, making tactical decisions based on mathematical calculations rather than human considerations. Colonel Vastok, our regimental commander, exemplified this approach through his practice of referring to soldiers by their serial numbers rather than their names, issuing orders that treated squads as statistical units rather than groups of human beings, and evaluating mission success based on objectives achieved rather than lives preserved. His approach was tactically sound and psychologically necessary for maintaining command effectiveness, but it created additional alienation for soldiers who were already struggling with moral contradictions. The emotional detachment of our leadership created a command environment where individual soldiers felt abandoned by the very system they were dying to defend. Orders were issued without explanation of their strategic purpose. Casualties were reported as statistical data rather than human losses, and survival was treated as a matter of luck rather than skill or leadership quality. The alienation was intensified by the behavior of regimental commissars, whose primary function was maintaining discipline through fear rather than inspiring loyalty through leadership. The commissars operated according to quotas that required them to execute a specified number of soldiers each month for various infractions, creating an atmosphere where any behavior could be interpreted as grounds for summary execution. Commissar Draken, who was assigned to our company, had earned advancement through his efficiency in identifying and eliminating defeatist attitudes among enlisted personnel. His methods included random interrogations, surveillance of private conversations, and psychological manipulation designed to encourage soldiers to inform on each other for minor infractions that could justify executions. The surveillance system created an environment where normal human emotional responses to combat trauma were criminalized, while soldiers were required to maintain artificial enthusiasm for operations that were obviously suicidal. Any expression of fear, doubt, or concern for fallen comrades could be interpreted as evidence of insufficient loyalty to the Emperor, warranting immediate execution pour encourager les autres. During our third month on Magnolia, I witnessed Commissar Draken execute Private Kolosov for undermining unit morale by expressing concern about the safety of a patrol route that had already cost 2 squads their lives. Kolosov's concerns were tactically valid, and his suggestions for alternative approaches were strategically sound, but his willingness to question established procedures was deemed more dangerous than the enemy forces that were killing Imperial soldiers. The execution was conducted in front of the entire company, with Draken providing detailed explanation of why Kolosov's behavior constituted treason against the Emperor. The explanation included analysis of how doubt and questioning could spread through military units like an infection, undermining the psychological conditioning that enabled soldiers to follow orders that their rational minds recognized as suicidal. But the execution also served as an example of how the Imperial system prioritized compliance over competence, eliminating soldiers who demonstrated independent thinking while preserving those who followed orders without regard for their tactical soundness. The system selected for obedience rather than effectiveness, creating military units that were disciplined but incapable of adapting to changing battlefield conditions. The psychological impact of witnessing executions of fellow soldiers created trauma that was additional to the stress of combat operations, while the random nature of the selection process meant that any soldier could be executed at any time for behavior that had previously been considered acceptable. The unpredictability created constant anxiety that degraded combat performance while undermining unit cohesion. More disturbing was the realization that the execution quotas meant that commissars had incentives to find infractions whether or not they actually existed, creating a system where soldiers could be executed for imaginary crimes if real ones weren't available. The quotas ensured a steady supply of executions that would maintain discipline through fear while eliminating potential troublemakers before they could influence other soldiers. The combination of combat stress, moral contradictions, leadership failures, and execution terror created psychological conditions that drove many soldiers beyond their breaking points while providing no legitimate means for addressing their trauma. Soldiers who sought medical assistance for combat stress were classified as malingerers and executed for cowardice, while those who continued fighting despite obvious psychological damage were considered acceptable casualties if their conditions didn't interfere with mission completion. By our 4th month on Magnolia, I had witnessed the deaths of over 400 fellow soldiers while participating in operations that had achieved negligible strategic results against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each Imperial attack. The mathematical reality was that our regiment was being consumed by attrition while contributing nothing meaningful to the broader war effort. The turning point came during Operation Purification, a massive assault on the Hive City's lower levels that was designed to eliminate genestealer breeding chambers while establishing Imperial control over strategic infrastructure. The operation involved committing our entire regiment, along with supporting elements from 3 other Imperial Guard units, representing the largest coordinated attack since our arrival on Magnolia. The intelligence preparation for Operation Purification revealed that genestealer forces had spent months preparing defensive positions throughout the target area, using their infiltration of planetary infrastructure to create kill zones, demolition traps, and coordination networks that would make conventional assault tactics extremely costly. The enemy possessed every possible advantage except raw numbers, and even that advantage was questionable given their ability to recruit additional forces from corrupted civilian populations. The operational plan acknowledged these disadvantages while concluding that acceptable casualty rates for achieving strategic objectives would range from 60 to 80% of committed forces. The plan explicitly stated that unit survival was secondary to mission completion, and that soldiers should expect to die during the operation while taking pride in their contribution to eventual Imperial victory. The pre-operation briefing conducted by Colonel Vastock was remarkable for its brutal honesty about our prospects for survival combined with complete indifference to the human cost of achieving military objectives. He explained that Operation Purification was necessary regardless of casualties because allowing the genestealer infestation to continue growing would eventually threaten the entire planet, making our sacrifice a mathematical necessity for preventing larger disasters. But he also explained that our regiment had been selected for this operation because we were considered expendable assets whose loss would not significantly impact Imperial military capabilities in other sectors. Newer regiments with better equipment and more extensive training were being preserved for operations that were considered more strategically important, making our deployment a matter of resource allocation rather than tactical necessity. The revelation that we were being sacrificed, not because our deaths were necessary for victory, but because our lives were considered less valuable than those of other Imperial forces, created a level of demoralization that approached mutiny. Soldiers who had accepted the possibility of death in service to the Emperor found it difficult to maintain loyalty when their deaths served primarily to preserve more valuable military assets. But any expression of dissatisfaction with our assignment was immediately suppressed by commissars who executed 7 soldiers during the final briefing for defeatist attitudes that threatened operational security. The executions served as reminders that the enemy behind us was more immediate and certain than the enemy we would face during the assault, making compliance with orders a matter of short-term survival rather than long-term strategy. Operation Purification began at 0400 hours with artillery bombardment designed to suppress enemy defensive positions while creating breaches in the structural barriers that protected genestealer territory. The bombardment continued for 3 hours and involved every available Imperial artillery asset, representing the most concentrated firepower that had been deployed on Magnolia since our arrival. The artillery preparation created massive destruction throughout the target area, collapsing buildings, destroying infrastructure, and eliminating many of the defensive positions that genestealer forces had prepared for the assault. But the bombardment also eliminated cover and concealment that attacking Imperial forces would need for protection during their advance, creating tactical conditions that favored defenders who possessed superior mobility and individual combat effectiveness. My squad was assigned to the 3rd wave of the assault, following initial attacks by specialized stormtrooper units and the main assault by regular infantry companies. Our mission was to secure objectives that had been captured by previous waves while establishing defensive positions that could be held against counterattacks by surviving Genestealer forces. The first two waves achieved their initial objectives, but suffered casualty rates that exceeded planning projections, with specialized units losing 70% of their personnel, while regular infantry companies lost over 80%. The success of the initial assault created tactical opportunities for subsequent waves, but it also demonstrated that casualty estimates had been optimistic rather than realistic. When the third wave began its advance, we moved through areas littered with the bodies of Imperial soldiers who had died achieving the objectives we were now tasked with securing. The casualties were so extensive that movement was hindered by the need to navigate around corpses while avoiding areas where wounded soldiers were calling for medical assistance that would not be provided. The psychological impact of advancing through fields of Imperial dead, while knowing that we would likely join them within hours, created a level of terror that threatened unit cohesion despite months of conditioning designed to prepare us for such conditions. The reality of mass casualties was more disturbing than any training exercise could simulate, making it difficult to maintain tactical focus while processing the emotional trauma of witnessing systematic destruction of human life. But the advance continued according to operational timelines because stopping to address psychological trauma would have disrupted coordination with other units while providing additional opportunities for enemy counterattacks. Soldiers who became incapacitated by emotional responses to the carnage were abandoned to maintain momentum, while those who remained functional were expected to ignore their dead and wounded comrades while focusing on tactical objectives. The enemy resistance we encountered was more sophisticated and effective than intelligence estimates had predicted, with Genestealer forces using tunnel networks and concealed positions to conduct coordinated attacks that exploited weaknesses in Imperial tactical formations. The enemy had observed Imperial assault tactics during previous operations and had developed countermeasures that neutralized many of our standard procedures. More disturbing was the discovery that many of the enemy forces we were fighting were actually corrupted Imperial personnel who had been captured during previous operations and transformed into hybrid warriors under Genestealer control. These hybrid soldiers retained their military training while gaining enhanced physical capabilities and alien tactical insights, making them far more dangerous than pure Genestealers or untrained cultists. Fighting former Imperial soldiers who had been corrupted by alien influence created moral complications that our training had not prepared us to address. The hybrid warriors were recognizably human in appearance and behavior, but their loyalty had been transferred to alien masters, while their enhanced capabilities made them superior to unmodified humans in every category of combat effectiveness. During one engagement, I found myself fighting a hybrid warrior whose uniform identified him as a member of the Cadian 47th Infantry, a regiment that had been deployed to Magnolia 6 months before our arrival and had been declared destroyed after losing contact with higher headquarters. The warrior retained enough human speech to taunt us with information about the fate of his original unit while demonstrating combat skills that exceeded anything we had encountered during training. The hybrid explained that his transformation had been voluntary, chosen as an alternative to death after his original unit had been surrounded and offered the choice between destruction and assimilation. He claimed that service to the Genestealer Patriarch was more rewarding than service to the Emperor because it provided genuine purpose rather than meaningless sacrifice for leaders who viewed soldiers as disposable resources. The psychological warfare was as effective as the physical combat, forcing Imperial soldiers to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of loyalty and service while fighting for their lives against enemies who had once shared their values and allegiances. The hybrid warriors used their knowledge of Imperial tactics and psychology to create maximum psychological impact, while exploiting tactical opportunities that pure alien forces might have missed. But the most disturbing aspect of fighting former Imperial soldiers was the realization that their transformation might represent an improvement in their condition rather than a corruption of their original nature. The hybrid warriors demonstrated enthusiasm and purpose that contrasted sharply with the demoralization and fear that characterized Imperial forces. suggesting that alien influence might provide psychological benefits that Imperial service could not offer. The engagement continued for 18 hours as Imperial forces fought to secure objectives, while Genestealer forces conducted coordinated counterattacks designed to eliminate invading troops while preserving their own tactical positions. The battle was characterized by close-quarters combat in confined spaces where conventional Imperial advantages in firepower and coordination were minimized, while enemy advantages in individual capability and environmental knowledge were maximized. My squad suffered 80% casualties during the engagement, with 6 soldiers killed and 2 others wounded so severely that they required immediate evacuation. The tactical objectives were achieved according to operational parameters, but the cost in human life was so extreme that the success felt more like defeat than victory. The aftermath of Operation Purification revealed that Imperial forces had suffered casualty rates exceeding 70% while achieving tactical objectives that intelligence analysts described as strategically insignificant in terms of overall campaign success. The operation had eliminated several Genestealer breeding chambers and secured some infrastructure targets, but it had failed to break enemy resistance or establish Imperial control over the contested areas. More importantly, the operation had consumed most of our regiment's effective combat strength while providing negligible advancement toward campaign completion. The mathematical reality was that several additional operations of similar scope would be required to achieve strategic victory, but our regiment no longer possessed sufficient personnel to conduct such operations without extensive reinforcement. The casualty reports were processed through administrative channels and filed as acceptable losses for operations of this type, while surviving personnel were reassigned to other units or provided with replacement soldiers to restore authorized strength levels. The bureaucratic response to mass casualties was so routine and emotionless that it reinforced the impression that human life had no value beyond its utility for achieving tactical objectives. But the psychological impact on surviving soldiers was severe enough to require intervention by regimental commissars who executed additional personnel for defeatist attitudes while implementing enhanced surveillance measures designed to prevent the spread of demoralization that could undermine future operations. The executions and surveillance created additional stress for survivors who were already struggling with combat trauma while processing the moral contradictions of their service. The breaking point for many soldiers came with the realization that Operation Purification had been conducted primarily to provide combat experience for regimental officers rather than to achieve strategic objectives that were essential for planetary defense. Intelligence reports revealed that alternative tactical approaches could have achieved similar results with significantly lower casualty rates. But those approaches would not have provided the type of command experience that officers needed for career advancement. The revelation that hundreds of soldiers had died to enhance the professional development of their commanders created a level of disillusionment that threatened the ideological foundations of Imperial service. Soldiers who had accepted sacrifice as necessary for defending humanity found it impossible to maintain loyalty when their deaths served primarily to improve officer fitness reports. By our 6th month on Magnolia, I had reached the conclusion that continued service in the Imperial Guard was incompatible with psychological survival or moral integrity. The system that claimed to defend humanity was consuming human lives at rates that exceeded the threats it claimed to address, while the leadership that demanded sacrifice had demonstrated complete indifference to the welfare of soldiers under their command. The decision to desert was not made impulsively, but represented the logical conclusion of months of observation and analysis that revealed the fundamental contradictions in Imperial military service. The Emperor's protection was a myth, the brotherhood of soldiers was undermined by systematic betrayal, and the glory of service was revealed as elaborate propaganda designed to justify mass murder conducted by the Imperial system against its own defenders. The opportunity for desertion came during the evacuation of Imperial forces from Magnolia after intelligence reports indicated that Tyranid hive fleets were approaching the system while Genestealer forces had succeeded in establishing communication with their alien masters. The planetary government had requested immediate evacuation of all Imperial personnel while implementing virus-bombing protocols that would sterilize the planet before Tyranid forces arrived. The evacuation was conducted under emergency conditions that created chaos and confusion among Imperial forces while providing opportunities for soldiers to escape official oversight. During the loading of transport vehicles, I separated from my assigned unit and concealed myself among civilian refugees who were being evacuated to prevent their consumption by advancing alien forces. The refugee transport was overcrowded and undersupervised, creating conditions where additional passengers could blend into the crowd without being detected by transportation authorities. The refugees were desperate and traumatized, making them unlikely to report suspicious behavior while focusing on their own survival concerns. The journey to the refugee processing station took 4 days aboard transport vessels that were designed for cargo rather than human passengers, creating conditions that were deliberately harsh to discourage abuse of evacuation procedures. But the harsh conditions also prevented careful monitoring of passenger manifests, allowing unauthorized personnel to remain undetected if they were willing to endure the suffering that official policies imposed on legitimate refugees. The refugee processing station was a bureaucratic nightmare designed to categorize and redistribute displaced populations while screening for security threats that might have infiltrated evacuation convoys. The processing involved extensive documentation, medical examination, and interrogation procedures that could last for weeks while determining appropriate disposition for each individual refugee. But the system was overwhelmed by the volume of evacuees from Magnolia and other worlds that had been compromised by Tyranid advance forces, creating administrative chaos that provided opportunities for individuals to manipulate their documentation while avoiding detailed scrutiny. The bureaucratic confusion was compounded by corruption among processing officials who were willing to expedite procedures in exchange for bribes or other considerations. I successfully obtained civilian documentation that identified me as a factory worker from Magnolia, whose employment records had been destroyed during the planetary evacuation. The false documentation was sufficient to pass routine screening while providing legal justification for transportation to industrial worlds that needed additional workers for military production facilities. The transportation to my new assignment took 6 weeks aboard civilian vessels that were far more comfortable than military transports, while providing access to news and information that revealed the broader context of Imperial military operations throughout the sector. The information confirmed that the situation on Magnolia was representative rather than exceptional, with Imperial Guard regiments throughout the galaxy suffering similar casualty rates, while achieving tactical objectives that served no strategic purpose. My new life as a civilian worker in an Imperial armaments factory provided perspective on the military machine that I had served, while revealing the extent to which Imperial society was organized around the consumption of human resources for military purposes. The factory where I was employed produced laser guns and flak armor for Imperial Guard regiments, manufacturing equipment that I knew from experience was barely adequate for the tasks it was designed to perform. The workers in the armaments factory were mostly former Imperial Guard veterans who had completed their service obligations or had been discharged due to injuries that made them unfit for continued military duty. Their conversations revealed that my experiences on Magnolia were typical rather than exceptional, with every Imperial Guard veteran possessing similar stories of systematic waste and casual brutality that characterized Imperial military operations. But the factory workers also revealed that civilian life in the Imperium was only marginally better than military service, with industrial workers subjected to similar discipline, surveillance, and execution quotas that ensured compliance with production requirements. The same commissars who maintained discipline in Imperial Guard regiments also operated in civilian facilities, executing workers for sabotage or defeatist attitudes that threatened production efficiency. The realization that Imperial society was organized as a totalitarian system that treated all human beings as disposable resources made it clear that desertion had provided escape from military service, but not from the fundamental problems that made life in the Imperium unbearable for anyone who wasn't part of the ruling elite. My name was Private Torvin Hecht, and I learned that the terrifying truth of life as an Imperial Guardsman is that you are not defending humanity. You are serving a system that views humanity as raw material to be processed into tactical advantages through industrial-scale suffering and death. This is what they don't tell you when they speak of glory and honor in Imperial service. That courage is irrelevant when your commanders view you as ammunition, that training is meaningless when your equipment is designed to fail, and that loyalty is worthless when the system you serve considers your death more valuable than your life. The Imperial Guard is not an army. It is a machine for converting human beings into military statistics, processing millions of lives into tactical data, while measuring success in terms of acceptable extinction rates. The soldiers who serve in this machine are not heroes. They are victims of a system so vast and callous that it treats genocide as standard operating procedure. We are the billions who have died, screaming on worlds whose names we never learned. The countless souls whose sacrifice purchased nothing but time for leaders who measure victory in body counts rather than strategic achievement. We are the fodder fed into the Emperor's war machine, the raw material processed into tactical advantages through suffering that serves no purpose beyond perpetuating the system that demands it. Remember us not as heroes who died defending humanity, but as warnings about the true cost of Imperial victory. We are proof that the greatest enemy of humanity is not the aliens or heretics that threaten the Imperium, but the Imperium itself, a system so committed to its own survival that it will consume infinite human lives rather than question the assumptions that justify mass murder as military necessity. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But the war is not between humanity and its enemies. It is between the human spirit and the machine that claims to protect it, while systematically destroying everything that makes humanity worth protecting. We are the Imperial Guard, the walking dead of the 41st Millennium, and our service is not protection but participation in the slow suicide of our own species. The Emperor protects nothing except the system that feeds on human suffering, and we are both its servants and its prey. This is the terrifying truth that they will never tell you, but that every Imperial Guardsman learns before they die. That honor is horror, that service is slavery, and that the greatest victory the Imperium can achieve is learning to stop consuming itself in pursuit of victories that are indistinguishable from defeat.